All right, welcome contractors and visitors. Porex is committed to providing a safe work environment for all of our employees, visitors, and contractors. Porex is committed to minimizing risk to the public, minimizing impact to the environment. Porex is also committed to be complying with all our federal, state, and local regulations, and then compliance with Porex safety procedures first and foremost. We're going to take a little time to go through a brief orientation to kind of, if you don't have an opportunity to go through an instructor-led orientation, this would be another option to that process. At the end of the orientation, you should have received a test. Complete that test and turn it in to your host, your EHS leader at the Porex Fairburn site. It's just a record of retention to make sure we understood the material that reviewed during the orientation. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to the facility manager for a brief statement, and then we'll get started with the orientation. Thank you. Additional contractor requirements. Any contractor that is bringing materials on site that could be considered harmful or hazardous to the facility, you're responsible in most cases to make sure that is properly disposed of, unless there's been some prior agreement with the Porex facility on us accepting the disposal costs for those wastes. So if you have any questions, please contact your host, but all of that should be agreed to prior to the work and should be captured in your scope of work and the quote provided to us. So all tools and equipment, personal PPE must be in good working condition, especially fall protection. Any electrical equipment used, make sure that we inspect prior to every use. Fall protection, SRLs, lanyards, harnesses, that sort of thing. Do not touch or operate any Porex equipment without permission. Anytime a contractor is using Porex equipment, that they should be agreed to prior to them coming on site. It should be captured in their scope of work and the quote. If a scissor lift is needed, it should be captured in the quote. If there's an agreement with Porex, then we'll honor those requests. So make sure that's agreed upon prior to you coming on site. Comply with all signs and placards, any GHS information, any signs with PPE requirements. Make sure that we're following instructions there. Your work may be monitored by site staff, and it will be. The contractor pre-use checklist, we're rolling that out pretty soon, so those will be asked for. As we're performing our safety standard work, we'll be walking around observing contractor work, making sure that their permits are filled out completely and posted at the job site. So that'll be a new requirement for all contractors. The hosting contractor is responsible for ensuring all subcontractors understand Porex rules and guidelines. So that's the responsibility of the host contractor to make sure any additional contractors they bring in are following the rules and understand the rules. All of our site leadership is available at all times. So make sure if the rules are unclear or if they need further explanation, to give one of us a call, and we'll be glad to further explain that. In addition, prevention and controls of explosions. Porex facility, polypropylene is our primary raw material. Polypropylene is a byproduct of oil, and it does fall under the explosive, the NFPA explosive dust standard. So we have certain guidelines that we have to comply with from an explosive dust standpoint. The most critical work that contractors are doing would be hot work permit process. That is, what goes along with that. Obviously the area's got to be clean within a 30-foot radius. There has to be a fire watch, a full-time fire watch. That means a person doing fire watch, not assisting with work or doing the work. You got to have a dedicated fire watch. They have to provide. You should be providing your own fire extinguishers, using heat blankets, heat shields when necessary. But housekeeping is by far the most critical, or one of the most critical parts to the hot work permit process, just due to the our base raw material being polypropylene. So ensure your areas, if you're doing hot work, take it to the maintenance shop whenever possible. If you have to do work in the field, that requires the permit process to be signed off by a Porex employee. So always make sure that we're following the guidelines there. Preventative maintenance on equipment such as dust collectors and duct work. Anytime we're doing service work around the dust collectors, make sure that that we're following all the Porex standards. If you have any questions regard to any hot work or any service or work around the dust collectors, please make sure you ask questions to maintenance, engineering, or EHS. Okay, in the event of emergency, there will be an audible alarm sounded for evacuation. All contractors, visitors are required to evacuate the facility along with all Porex employees. When that alarm sounds off, you want to go to the closest exit possible, whether that's at the back or the front. You go out of the facility. If you're exiting through the back, come around to the front of the facility where the Porex sign is located out on the front lawn. All of our areas will be designated to their locations, their departments. The evacuation coordinator will do a roll call to make sure all employees are accounted for. Relocation will be to the primary hallway with the flags and the time clocks. Every department is posted in that area, so that will be our relocation, and that will be announced through the PA system. So if you hear the alarm, the evacuation alarm, I'll play an example. That's what the evacuation alarm sounds like. In case you hear that, closest exit, come around to the front of the facility. All right, just a couple do's and don'ts when it comes to an evacuation. Everybody needs to remain calm. We need to walk with urgency, no running. Don't worry about any of your personal equipment, any of your tools. Everything is, when it comes to an evacuation, we're trying to get out of the building as quickly and efficiently as possible. Don't hang around, wait on other employees. You will exit immediately and report to your evacuation muster point for roll call. In addition to the evacuation, we always need to make sure too that we keep or maintain a safe egress to all exit doors. If we have scissor lifts, elevated work platforms, scaffolding, anything that could hinder egress is something that you may need to get some Porex leadership involved with. Always make sure we have clear paths for not only our contractors but the Porex employees also. Anytime we need to block doors, put up barricades to provide a safe work area, all of that needs to be verified and agreed to with the host facility. Chemical spills and releases. Report all chemical spills and releases to your supervisor, your host, immediately. Any loss of containment should be reported immediately. Any hazardous chemicals, anything that's brought on site by a contractor should receive prior approval from Porex. Anything brought on site that could be considered hazardous or anything for that reason should be approved by Porex. Contractors are responsible for all the removal of any waste generated while they're on site. Report any spills, no matter how minor that is, to your host or the EHS leader for the site. All right, in the event of an injury, in case any one of the contract employees or subcontractors is involved in an injury, an incident, anything with a property damage, always make sure that we're reporting those events to the host or the EHS leader for the site. no matter how minor those are. If we do have a trained emergency response team or safety team that has access to first aid equipment, if they've been trained in CPR, first aid, emergency response, incident command. So make sure that in case of an event, make sure all events are reported and documented. As far as emergency equipment goes, we do have 2 AEDs located on site. We've got one in the front office area next to the wellness room. We do have another one located outside the first aid room across from the break area. Those AEDs are not locked. They're accessible for all contractors, all trained contractors, and Porex members of the Porex safety team. We do have a first aid room with additional medical supplies in case those are ever needed. Just make sure we report on all injuries, any events, anytime there's a use of emergency equipment. Make sure you notify your Porex host or the EHS leader. Personal protective equipment, PPE, is required at all times in manufacturing areas. Safety shoes, steel-toed shoes. There is some composites that meet the ASTM standard. Those are all acceptable. Safety glasses and earplugs, that's our standard PPE for the site. Depending on the type of work you're doing, there could be additional PPE that is the contractor's responsibility. It could be hard hats, respirators, flame retardant clothing if you're doing hot work. All of that is required to be supplied by the contractor unless there's some other agreement made. Fall protection, lanyards, any rigging equipment, all of that is required depending on the type of work that you're doing, and is the responsibility of the contractor. All right, SDSs are available on request. Any chemicals that are on site in the Fairburn facility are available. Those are electronic. They're kept on the 2 kiosk computers in the break room. Those are shared computers. All employees have access to the SDS, the database that keeps all of our electronic SDSs. Again, any chemicals brought on site by the contractor, whether that's the host contractor or the subcontractor, must be approved. All of those chemicals must be removed from the site when the work is completed, and any additional waste that's produced from use of chemicals is the responsibility of the contractor unless there's prior agreement made. All chemical containers must be labeled with the identity of the chemical inside, the appropriate hazard warnings, or alternative words, pictures, symbols, or a combination of both. We are a GHS compliant facility. All new chemicals have to be approved. All chemicals transferred into secondary containers must be labeled. They must have GHS labels, pictograms, warning symbols. Any chemicals brought on site by the contractor must meet the GHS requirements. Any chemicals transferred to secondary containers, those must be labeled and meet the GHS requirements also. If additional GHS labels are needed, see the site EHS leader will be happy to provide the proper labels for any secondary containers. All right, SPCC, Spill Prevention Control and Countermeasures Plan. Porex does comply with the EPD, EPA in this situation. We do have an SPCC plan. Anytime a facility has over 1,300 gallons above ground, they're required to have an SPCC plan. It just basically means I have to have an inventory of every drum of hydraulic fluid, oil, any reservoirs that contain any type of hydraulic or oil-based fluids. Have to have an inventory of that. So anytime maintenance or contractors are doing service on certain equipment, all of that has to be reclaimed and recycled. That is a regulated waste. It's not a hazardous waste, but it is regulated and it have to be disposed of as such. Porex does have we do operate under a stormwater permit. Again, that's regulated by the EPD or the EPA. Porex is considered a covered facility under the SAC and must comply with Georgia's NPDES stormwater discharge permit. For our contractors, what does this mean to you? It is basically saying is stormwater. If we have a stormwater event at the facility, any equipment that stormwater comes in contact with must be a clean discharge. If you're demoing equipment, moving equipment, doing outside construction, anything where there's an exposure from a stormwater event, if a gearbox or a piece of equipment is left outside of the facility, we have a stormwater event, any raw materials is left outside, any of that runoff that basically discharges from the site that goes out, any of the two outfalls located at our facility is a violation of our stormwater permit. So all outside chemicals, anything stored outside, the stormwater runoff, all of that follows under our stormwater permit. If you're unsure about what equipment or processes that can be left outside, contact your host or the Porex EHS leader. All right, lockout tagout is basically designed to prevent the accidental startup of equipment during servicing, maintenance, and operations. All Porex facilities, all Porex operators and maintenance employees that are authorized for the use of lockout tagout have been trained. Training is required for all of our contractors. Any contractor that is throwing disconnects, that is applying a lockout device to a piece of equipment is required to be trained. Those training records should be available on request, so always be prepared for that and make sure that we're bringing in competent employees to do the work that you're contracted to do. All locks and tags must be identifiable with contractor name and company. So they should be clearly legible with the contractor name, the piece of equipment they're working on. If a group lockout is required, make sure that we do have the proper group lockout hasps. Every employee that's working on a piece of equipment is required to have an individual lock. We don't use one lock for 5 or 6 employees. Every employee is required to have their own lock on a group lockout for that piece of equipment. If you have any questions regarding lockout procedures or requirements, contact your host or your EHS leader. Permit required confined spaces. Most of this type of work will be contracted out for the Fairburn facility. There is a couple situations where we reclassify a permitted space to a non-permitted space, but for the most part we will contract out our permitted entry. All contractors are required to be trained and authorized for permitted entry. They're responsible for all the emergency equipment for a rescue that's required for permitted entry. The training records for each employee that's brought on site for permitted entry should be available on request. This is a requirement that is really non-negotiable. All spaces should be properly labeled. The permit should be signed off by a Porex maintenance employee or the Porex EHS leader. Should have knowledge of all permitted entry. The contractor is responsible for supplying the emergency equipment, any air monitoring equipment that is required for that permitted entry. And again, always ask questions to site leadership, EHS, with any questions in regards to permitted confined space entry. All right, so we've already touched on this one a little bit, but Porex will provide all contractors performing hot work with a hot work permit. Anything that includes cutting, welding, grinding, anything with an open flame requires a permit for the facility. We've already discussed having that 30-foot radius. It must be clean. have no combustible materials, and paper, anything, any flammable chemicals must be removed from that area. The permit must be authorized by a maintenance supervisor or the EHS leader for the site. The contractor is required to have a dedicated fire watch. That's a person that's doing fire watch only. One person you can have one fire watch for two locations. That is permitted, long as they have visibility to both areas where the hot work is being performed. This is a non-negotiable item. Anytime we're performing hot work, permit has to be posted in the area where the hot work is being completed. If you have any questions, always ask maintenance or EHS. The Porex General Contractor Permit. This is a new process for a Fairburn facility. It's a contractor pre-planning job checklist. It's a comprehensive checklist that covers several different areas. Simple PPE, working at heights, the tie-off rules, major lifts. It's a really comprehensive checklist to make sure that we've evaluated all the hazards for performing certain duties. So this file will be shared electronically, and there will be hard copies at the site for all contractors to complete before they perform any work. This checklist will need to be posted at the site, and then site leadership will be auditing, performing our standard work, and monitoring all contractor activity for compliance to this checklist. And again, always, ask questions for site leadership or EHS. All right, working at heights awareness. Anytime we have contractor activity or work that's being done overhead, we need to ensure that we have the perimeter controlled. The use of red barricade basically signifies that is a no-go zone. That is, we look at red the same as a lockout, right? If we're controlling our perimeter, there's a red barricade, then that is absolutely no entry. There should be no Porex employee or any other employee other than the contractor that is working in that area. Nobody should be coming through that barricade without permission from the owner of that barricade. Yellow barricade is it's just a cautionary step. Hey, we are doing some level of work. Maybe the floors are slippery, or we're doing something. So that allows employees, they can come through, with permission, but just be careful. So yellow is more of the cautionary barricade. Tie off when working on mobile elevated working platforms, scissor lifts, boom lifts. This is something that Porex hasn't enforced in the past, but moving forward, we will require contractors, anytime they're inside of a lift working over 4 feet, to follow the OSHA tie-off guidelines. Anchor inside of the scissor lift, have rated harness, lanyard, or an SRL for tie-off. Again, this is something that we haven't enforced, but we will moving forward. And then another addition to that is we should never climb out of the basket. Any operational or contractor work that requires an employee to climb out of the basket to perform that work has to be approved by the site EHS leader. So if you're doing work and that is required, you need to follow up with your site host, get EHS involved, and make sure that we're not doing any work that hasn't been approved. All right, additional working at height rules are, we do follow the OSHA 1910 standard. I know the construction standard 1926 calls out 6 feet. You're allowed to go 6 feet without tie off, but we are in the general industry, so we are following the 4 foot rule. If there's any questions about that or any discussions we need to have, definitely feel free to reach out regarding that. So fall protection is mandatory when working above 4 feet. That includes, again, scissor lift, JLGs, any mobile equipment. Employers and contractors are responsible for providing their own PPE. They're required to inspect that PPE before every use. Full body harnesses, no belts, only full body harnesses, SRLs and or shock absorbing lanyards are okay. Lanyards must connect to the anchor point and center D-ring. That's pretty standard when it comes to harnesses. 100% tie off is required. So if you're moving, you're transferring, you're moving from one elevation to another elevation, like with a scissor lift, you are required to transfer those tie off points. We are also required to have tie off points that are rated for 5,000 pounds or greater. A lot of contractors use beam clamps, straps for structural steel. The structural steel is an acceptable tie-off point with the properly rated strap or a beam clamp for tie-off. Those are permitted. And if you're doing work from a ladder, stay within the confines of the ladder. We like to follow the belt buckle or the naval rule. You know, keep your center, your belt buckle within the framework of the ladder when working at heights, and always maintain those 3 points of contact whenever possible. Again, we appreciate all of our contractors helping us work together, ensuring that we have a safe, productive working environment for all personnel. We couldn't do it without you guys, so we appreciate you being there for us, supporting the facility, and helping make Porex a better, safer organization. So hopefully this orientation was helpful. If you have any questions, definitely reach out to us, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.